Basic Training ASG Cloud Factory 8.1. This is the architecture requirements and installation of CloudRobot. This is video part number 2. It is also recommended, if you haven't watched yet, our other video related to Cloud Store, which covers Robot and Store Introduction Part 1. So in this particular training, we're going to talk about the video training introduction, CloudRobot architecture, CloudRobot requirements, prepare the infrastructure, and the installation of CloudRobot using a live demo. For the basic architecture, first of all, what modules we are interacting. The basic requirements, supported operating system, databases, environment requirements, and components. And keep in mind, some of them have been seen in our pre-requirement slides as well. How to prepare the infrastructure? Well, we have to keep in mind we have to create AD users, groups, and new OUs. Prepare the Microsoft Internet Information Services, the web server. Install the MongoDB and install the RabbitMQ message bus. If you install all of the components together in a single machine, you do not have to make modifications in RabbitMQ. However, if you're installing in 2 different servers like we do, you have to make sure you allow guest access outside the VM that you installed. So, the basic installation components has 3 components in CloudRobot. The robot itself, the repository designer, and the workflow designer. And of course, basics about the workflows. It is related to services, workflows, and activities. And in Cloud Store, just connecting both products together, we always relate the workflows as services. So what is the architecture then? In this module, we see that we need a deployment and lifecycle component, which is the infrastructure that we install in Cloud Shaper. Not in this particular video. Then we have the workflow and self-service piece. This is the component that we called CloudRobot, the workflows and so on. So here we can see start, input, approval, delivery, and of course work. And on top of that, the interaction always happens on the Cloud Cockpit level, which is a DWP component. So Cloud Store talks to Cloud Cockpit using our single sign-on component. So Store has a direct connection to Robot. And users always use Cockpit and Store as part of the execution. And that actually sums up the entire Cloud Factory version 8. But how it is in the back end? Well, this is a good picture that shows you a little bit more about the infrastructure. The heart of the solution always uses a service bus. And this service bus is RabbitMQ. So Cloud Store, CloudRobot, they use this particular bus to communicate to each other. If we include other products like iTasm, for example, it can also use the service bus to interact with the rest of the technology. And on the left side, we can see that we have a SQL server where the workflow tracking data is, usually where the reports are presented. And we also have in the robot database, we have MongoDB, where we store all XAML workflows. We also use the repository designer data in there and the workflow designer there. So in other words, the MongoDB doesn't grow as much as the SQL database from a reporting perspective. And in the cloud workflow engine, what do you see? Well, we see Exchange workflows, we see SharePoint workflows, we see Active Directories, and other business packs, which could be OpenStack, it could be AWS, could be Azure, or other technologies that you might have. So the next step is, what are the requirements? And on the requirement side, we have to keep in mind we can either run on Windows Server 28 R2 or Windows 2012 R2. Microsoft .NET Framework 4.5 is always required and it must be active. Also, the CloudRobot database server needs to have the SQL Server installed. It can be on the same server or connected to the cluster. The MongoDB, it must be version 2.6 or above, and it should run on Windows at this point. And if you can use the version that it's optimized for Windows 2008 R2, that's even better. And Microsoft SQL 2008 or 2012 if you use the workflow analyzer. And for RabbitMQ message, it can either run on Windows 2008 or Windows Server 2012. We need to have DNS reverse lookup prepared, Active Directory for authentication, so OU structure needs to be configured as well. The workflow designer, as we can see, requires the same Windows modules as well. So Windows 2008 or Windows Server 2012. And the database, if you're using the workflow analyzer, can be the same as database server, and as well the cockpit database console as well. To prepare the infrastructure, we have to follow a few steps as well. So CloudRobot can work in a multi-tenant infrastructure. For this, we need Active Directory to be doing that. The first level, the OU, is mandatory to be hosting, and you have to have an admin hosting user ID. And depending on the levels that you have, you can have multiple levels created. So for example, in the documentation, we describe 15 steps to prepare the CloudRobot infrastructure. And the OU is always private. And this is a fixed name _private. That allows us to use a multi-tenant approach where users won't see each other, and departments or companies as well. So this is how it works. In the CN private hosting, we need to prepare these groups: customer admins, user groups, users, reseller admins, and user groups. All of these groups, they're always populated by CloudRobot, so you don't have to create every time you do that. But if you want to customize the content of these groups, yes, you can interact with Active Directory or configure CloudRobot and Store to add users to these specific groups. So now we will do the actual installation of CloudRobot, and we will be following all of these steps. But I want to remind you one thing. If you're using the installation in two different servers, where RabbitMQ it's in one place, Store is in a different place, you need to make sure that you have the rabbitmq.config configured properly. And this is a screenshot that shows the location and the content of this particular file. Here it guarantees that loopback users, which means they can access RabbitMQ outside the machine, so they can use the IP address or the host name. If that doesn't work after you set up this file, RabbitMQ documentation recommends you to uninstall RabbitMQ from the server, reinstall it, and make sure the config file is still there. And then you can try the RabbitMQ URL and see that will be working properly. What is the flow then for this whole installation process? First, we create the OUs and users and groups. We install RabbitMQ. We install MongoDB. We install CloudRobot Workflow Engine. And then we can continue the installation of the repository designer and workflow designer. And subsequently, we can install Cloud Store and then set up the integration between these two technologies. Once the installation is configured on the cockpit, on the robot server, these are the modules that you might see, the CloudRobot components. So let's transition to the installation process. video. The installation process for RabbitMQ is fairly simple. So we just download the version that it's 3.3.1 in this case. We run the installer with all of the settings that are required. Start menu, service, and MQ server. When the process is completed, let's verify if the service is installed. So just here, go to Services, Tools, Services. And here we have RabbitMQ service. So let's go back to our checklist. Here we'll see what we have done on the web server, plus what we have done in the app server, which means the RabbitMQ, SQL Server client, the Java client, and the MongoView DB. SQL Server, which is installed in the SQL VM in our case. So what is important us to do here, it's actually a typical install of SQL Server. In production environments, usually Cloud Factory is connected to an existing SQL Server cluster. In POCs, you may need to request a customer to have a SQL Server installed, or eventually, if you use the POC box, you can use an existing SQL Server. What you need to make sure when you install SQL Server or the databases for us, it is two things. It must be in mixed mode authentication, and the server collation needs to be SQL Latin 1 General CP1 CIAS. Active Directory configuration for CloudRobot. This stage, we're going to do the configuration in our domain controller. The process relies in three different steps. We need to create provisioning users, set up hosting organizations, and finally create organization units. To do that, we require to do the following structure: the company name, hosting providers, and of course different customers that you have on each one. And every customer might have different user IDs and types. For the demo environment that we're building here, the company.com, it's called CF demo, but we will be using the same structure: hosting ID, a private OU, with the customer names that we'll be fulfilling afterwards. The customers will be automatically created by CloudRobot. So to build this particular structure, we require to do certain steps in Active Directory. And the following steps are needed. We will need to use the Active Directory users and computers, first of all. We need to select the domain. We have to select a new from a context like a menu organization unit. Enter the name hosting. Be careful, this name hosting is mandatory in every Cloud Factory implementation. Then we will do the AD-SI edit, and then we will do the action to connect to the domain controller, and we will make changes to the hosting UU, where we will create a new object that will be a container class for the private configuration. This will make sure we have multi-tenancy created in our environment. The OUs for the customers are automatically created by the workflow engine. In this case, we called CloudRobot. Okay, what we need to do now is go into Active Directory in the domain controller. So here in the programs, we'll type active users and computers. We see here in the domain, and we will create a new organization unit. And we will call it hosting. Be careful, the name has to be exactly like this. And now we open the AD-SI tool. We connect to our domain, so it's fairly easy. Connect to. This is the domain name. In this case, we're connecting to the same machine. We click OK. We expand. We locate hosting. We right-click, New Object. And here we look for container. Next. And the value is underscore private. The name has to be exactly like this. Next, and finish. And that completes the cycle of the 10 steps that we described in the previous screen. And the last step for this tutorial, it is in Active Directory Domain Controller. We need to enable LDS. So if you're using Windows Server 2008 R2, you will see on the left side the option that you need to enable. And on the right side, you will see the option that you have to enable as well. Okay, so now I'm connected into my domain controller. I will go to Manage, Add Roles and Features, Role Base for this particular server, and enable here Active Directory Lightweight. Next, next, and let the process to be completed. So now let's install the CloudRobot. I will run the installer that we downloaded from ISP. We'll accept the license agreement. And now we need to select the components for this install. Remember, this is a decentralized installation. So we need to include the designer, the repository, workflow engine, workflow designer, the bus adapter, and we will install the query engine controller. Other services, they will be installed in the Cloud Store server. This is the email address to be sending notifications. The domain is correct. Let me put my domain controller name over here. Administrator at cfdemo.local. You could set up different accounts for administrator. In this case, I will use my own. The home directory, if you have different servers where the home directory should be saved. In this case, I will keep this default settings. My Exchange server. And now I will add the mail store name. In this case, it's mailbox database 09158 525 46. In fact, this information is stored in my Microsoft Exchange, so you can grab that information from yours as well. We don't have Zimbra, so click Next. We don't have SharePoint. We don't have Link. And here's where the MongoDB we have already installed, so we don't have to worry about. And this will be actually installing one as well. Now we just need to wait the installation process to be completed. Now we just need to complete the installation. Okay, so in this case, we need to make sure the user IDs and passwords are created. We can use user IDs and passwords that you define. I already have mine created. Same thing for the workflow designer. The name of the CloudRobot, I'll use the default settings. And the same thing for the query engine agent. Okay, so let's verify a couple of things. The controller will be installed in the web server, and the domain needs to be corrected. So here is CF demo. Server here is dc.cfdemo.local. My user, in this case, is the administrator, and the password. And the process is completed. Just to make sure, we come here to services. And we'll see the CloudRobot services now are starting and up and running.